A couple of weeks ago, the sitting Chief Minister of Uttar Pradesh, Yogi Adityanath, defended the banning of halal certification in the state, claiming without sources that halal products fund Islamist terrorism. Countering this, Indian Muslims have argued that halal is a dietary choice akin to Sattvic or Jain food, and with debate constantly raging around this term, it's worth stepping back to understand the history of halal and the various ways it's been seen by the peoples of Asia over time. Halal was once a prescriptive notion for good behaviors, but it has evolved through the centuries. It has been a marker of Muslim identity, a dog whistle for persecution, it has been a flexible political concept, and finally now it's a multi-billion-dollar global industry, but not in the way that the right wing wants you to think. To put it briefly, our contemporary notion of halal has very little to do with how Indians have seen halal in the past. So, simply put, halal refers to behaviors recommended or permitted by the Quran and Islamic jurisprudence. It's the opposite of haram, which are forbidden behaviors. Now, while halal meat has dominated headlines in contemporary India, halal technically applies to all spheres of life, from financial transactions to marriage customs. And in court arguments earlier this year, the Solicitor General of India, Tushar Mehta, expressed surprise that halal certification could extend to cement and water bottles. But since the term is meant to express what's good for Muslims to follow or purchase or do, it's not really a contradiction. Now, with all this said, since halal behaviors can be quite distinct, they do serve as a form of Muslim self-identification and as a way for other communities to demarcate or discriminate against Muslims. In an incident which was widely written about by medieval observers, including the famous traveler Marco Polo, you may have heard of, an insistence on halal was blown out of all proportion. Early in the year 1280, a group of Muslim merchants arrived in what is now Beijing to present fine eagles and falcons to Kublai Khan. Historian Johann Elveskog analyzes this meeting in his book Buddhism and Islam on the Silk Road, which you should read, by the way. Now, Kublai was the grandson of the infamous conqueror Genghis Khan and ruled China at the time. While the Khan was happy with the gifts, the banquet that came afterwards came to a very awkward halt because the Muslim merchants refused the meat dishes because they weren't halal. Kublai was furious. Soon after, on January 27, 1280, he issued an edict blaming various Muslim figures for political instability in previous decades. He concluded that this was because Muslims had refused to assimilate completely into Mongol traditions, and he gave the example of the merchants refusing non-halal meat. And finally, the Khan ordered a ban on various Muslim practices in China, including halal slaughter, circumcision, and cousin marriage. But as Elveskog points out, Kublai was a smarter politician than this incident might suggest. Muslims had been an influential class in Mongol-ruled China, working as merchants and tax collectors, and Kublai's predecessors, including Genghis Khan himself, had been extremely tolerant of Muslims. But China's Confucian bureaucracy was suspicious of them, and their popularity wasn't helped by high-profile corruption scandals involving Muslim ministers, against whom Kublai Khan had taken no action. So the Khan was quickly currying some favor with his Chinese subjects by turning on the Muslims he'd once patronized. In fact, according to Elveskog, the Muslim rebellions in Kublai's edict had not even happened in the Khan's territories, but in Central Asia. But soon, Muslim merchants and bureaucrats were forced to flee China, and they took with them their business and the tariffs that they brought. Kublai soon backpedaled, revoking his anti-halal decrees, but as Elveskog notes, the damage had been done. Muslims would never again be as influential in China, and Kublai's descendants would instead have to contend with the no less troublesome Chinese Confucian bureaucracy. Meanwhile, in the Indian Ocean world, some very different approaches to halal were taking shape. In northern India, the Delhi Sultanate had managed to consolidate a Muslim ruling class, with very reactionary intellectuals and clerics arriving there from Mongol-devastated Central Asia. Now, debates raged among the ulema or the clerics and the sultans. As Professor Satish Chandra demonstrates in his classic Medieval India from Sultanate to Mughals, Muslim rulers in India quickly grasped that pristine notions of halal and haram, permissible or forbidden, did not hold up to the realities of statecraft. In fact, even the clergy weren't above ignoring the textual injunctions. For example, Jalaluddin Khilji provoked controversy by declaring a policy of religious benevolence and disavowing forceful conversions, which was demanded by some clerics even though it was haram. But on the other hand, his nephew and successor, Alauddin Khilji, insisted on keeping subjects in line through public brutality, though the Qazi of Delhi at the time said that this was also haram. Now, on the Malabar coast, a couple of centuries later, the Samutri or the Zamorin of Kozhikode had also arrived at a compromise with the wealthy Muslim merchants of this great port. As we talked about in an early edition of Thinking Medieval, rulers on India's coast had a long history of benevolence to Muslim communities. In turn, Muslim merchants supplied them not only with goods and taxes but frequently with political and financial support. And so, accommodations could easily be found. Ma Huan, a Chinese Muslim voyager and translator, had this to say about Kozhikode's religious policy in the 1430s, and I quote, "The king and the people all refrain from eating the ox. The great chiefs are Muslim people and they all refrain from eating the flesh of the pig. Formerly, there was a king who made a sworn compact to the Muslim people saying, 'You do not eat the ox, I do not eat the pig. We will reciprocally respect the taboo,' and this compact has been honored right down to the present day." Textually speaking, beef was very much halal for Muslims. On the other hand, Hindus had no taboo against pork. In fact, medieval court manuals like the Manasolasa give mouth-watering recipes for barbecued pork ribs. But in India, texts couldn't be allowed to get in the way of mutually beneficial and respectful relationships. In fact, it was very much the same reasoning that drove early modern rulers like the Mughal Emperor Akbar to impose restrictions on the slaughter of cows, firstly on specific days and eventually nearly completely. According to Professor Chandra, this was aimed directly at integrating his Rajput vassals more firmly into the state apparatus. Akbar may also have been influenced by Jain intellectuals at his court like Hari Vijaya Suri. Now, the ulema was outraged. A cow slaughter on Eid al-Adha was considered halal, so the clerics Ahmad Sirhindi and Abd al-Qadir Badauni saw such policies as unnecessary concessions to infidels. Badauni, mind you, was born in Rajasthan and probably was a Muslim Rajput of some sort. Another aspect of these restrictions, though, which was much more difficult to address, is how communities, oppressed communities like Dalits, who historically relied on cow meat and leather and who hadn't been claimed by Hindus in the 17th century, how did they survive these bans? We have no idea. Now, despite all these considerations, the ban remained mostly in place until the reign of Aurangzeb, who rolled it back and affirmed the clerics' right to perform cow sacrifices. But even Aurangzeb still applied occasional restrictions in the interest of public order. Now, all this goes to show that the concept of halal has been interpreted in many ways over the centuries. Now, while it certainly applies to food, it also applies to notions of just rule, marriage, and financial relationships, among many others. But the Indian subcontinent has a long and demonstrable tradition of massaging or otherwise modifying notions of halal and haram to suit the realities of a diverse society, or at least to respect the sentiments of specific castes. Now, what also needs to be said is that the pre-modern scope of halal is not the same as that of today's consumerist world. From the 20th century onwards, the term found new meaning as Muslims across the world searched for identity in the aftermath of colonialism. And as the global market economy flourished, prosperous Muslims across the world developed a large appetite for halal products. While right-wing Hindu leaders have weaponized the word to discriminate against working-class Muslims, the rest of the world has been much more pragmatic around halal, which is ironically more in line with Indian history. And after all, look, technically speaking, just as a Muslim can consume Sattvic products, a Hindu or a Christian can consume or even produce and sell halal products. The Global Halal Industry, a research companion, estimates that the halal market is worth several $billion, with the most important sectors being food, travel, fashion, pharmaceuticals and cosmetics, and media and recreation. Now, Muslim-majority countries in the Indian Ocean, especially India's medieval trading partners, Malaysia and Indonesia, lead many of these sectors. However, non-Muslim majority countries like Singapore, the Netherlands and Belgium also have a substantial and lucrative presence in halal industries. Now, even while questions of cultural assimilation and integration rage on the European far right, many European countries do possess halal certification bodies. Now, even if for the sake of argument one were to set aside India's constitutional principles of individual liberty, it's historically ironic that Uttar Pradesh, which is larger than France and has a population of Muslims larger than that of the entire country of Morocco, doesn't recognize halal certification. The twisting and misunderstanding of India's past does serve short-term electoral gains, but it comes at the cost of discrimination, alienation, and endlessly missed economic opportunities. If you have questions or comments, we'd love to hear them. Follow us everywhere on social media. You can find me on Instagram at Anirudh and on Twitter at Kanisetti. We'll see you next week.